She arrived at that gathering in a patched dress and worn boots, while silk gowns swept the floor around her, and before the night was over, she would be the only woman Brock Hayes couldn't stop watching. Every wealthy widow in Red Hollow had spent months positioning herself to become mistress of the finest ranch in 3 counties. They brought jewels, charm, and connections. Nora Whitaker brought nothing but herself, and that, everyone agreed, was exactly the problem. They laughed at her openly. They didn't bother to lower their voices. What they didn't know was that the woman they dismissed as invisible was the only one among them who had already been quietly saving the world they all wanted to inherit. This is her story. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this has traveled. The dress had been mended twice at the left shoulder seam, and Nora knew it. She'd done the mending herself, late at night by lamplight, using thread that didn't quite match because the right color had run out 2 weeks ago and she hadn't had the coin to replace it. She'd tried to disguise the repair with a small tuck in the fabric, the kind of trick she'd learned from her mother, who had learned it from necessity rather than craft. Standing in front of the cracked mirror propped against her cabin wall that morning, she'd decided it was good enough. Not fine, not pretty. Good enough. That was the standard she'd been working against her whole life. Good enough. Red Hollow, on a Saturday, was a different animal than Red Hollow on any other day. The week's business collapsed into itself. Cattle dealers settling debts at the exchange office, families loading supplies into wagon beds, children running loose between horses. And for a few hours, the town shed its weekday practicality and became something that almost resembled a community. The autumn gathering at the Holloway barn had been a fixture for 11 years, ever since Thomas Holloway had built the place and declared that anyone in the county was welcome to dance, eat, and pretend the frontier wasn't trying to kill them. His widow, Pearl, kept the tradition going after his death, partly out of loyalty and partly because she understood that people needed at least one night a year when the hardness of their lives wasn't the only thing they could see. Nora had attended every year. She usually arrived after the crowd had settled, found a spot near the side tables where she could be useful without drawing attention, and left before the dancing got serious. It was a system that worked. Nobody bothered her. Nobody particularly noticed her either, but that was fine. Being unnoticed had a kind of freedom in it that Nora had come to appreciate. This year was different, and she'd known it would be from the moment she hitched her mule to the post outside and saw the carriages lined up along the south side of the barn. 4 of them, each one expensive in a way that didn't shout, but rather stated, the way wealth that has been around long enough learns to do. She recognized Dorothea Crane's bay horses, the matched pair that everyone in 3 counties knew cost more than most families earned in a year. Beside them, a dark lacquered carriage she didn't immediately recognize, and next to that, the Whitmore vehicle with its brass fittings and the initials embossed on the door panel. She stood there a moment in the dust, her mule blowing through its nose beside her, and thought about turning around. She didn't. She'd promised Pearl she'd help with the food table, and Nora Whitaker kept her promises even when keeping them was inconvenient. She tied off the mule, straightened the shoulder of her mended dress without quite meaning to, and went inside. The barn was lit with more lanterns than usual, and someone had strung dried wildflowers along the main beam. Pearl's touch, Nora guessed, though it might have been Aggie Marsh who had a weakness for decoration that her husband called a waste of time. Tables along the east wall held pies and bread and a roasted joint of something that smelled like it had been cooking since before noon. A fiddle was going in the corner, a slow tune that no one was dancing to yet. Children wove between adult legs with the specific focused chaos of children who have been told to behave and have decided that instruction doesn't apply to them. And there they were. She noticed them the way you notice weather, not because you're looking, but because the whole atmosphere shifts. Dorothea Crane stood near the center of the room in a green silk gown that caught the lamplight in a way that ordinary fabric simply didn't. She was 42, widowed 4 years prior when William Crane's heart had given out, and she had spent those 4 years managing his cattle interests with a competence that people acknowledged grudgingly and a wardrobe that people acknowledged outright. Beside her, Margaret Whitmore in deep blue, her dark hair pinned with what looked like actual garnets. And slightly apart from both of them, Helen Bassett, who had arrived in Red Hollow 18 months ago from somewhere back east, and who everyone agreed was very handsome, and who Helen Bassett herself agreed with even more enthusiastically. They were not, Nora noted, particularly interested in the pie table. They were interested in the man standing near the far wall in conversation with Pearl Holloway and two other ranchers whose names Nora knew, but whose faces she couldn't have picked from a crowd. Brock Hayes. She'd seen him before, obviously. Red Hollow wasn't large enough that you could avoid seeing anyone more than a week or two, and Hayes had been coming to town for supplies and business since before his father died and left him the ranch 7 years ago. He was not what she would have called a remarkable-looking man, not in the way that word usually meant, not polished or carefully assembled. He was tall, ran to lean rather than broad, with a face that had been thoroughly weathered by 8 or 9 years of working land that didn't much care about the men who worked it. He wore his hat pushed back tonight the way men do when they're indoors and forget to take it off entirely. And he was listening to whatever Pearl was saying with the particular kind of attention that meant he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak. She'd always noticed that about him, when she noticed him at all. He listened. She crossed to the food table, found Pearl's daughter Clara already there cutting the bread, and took her place at the end with the pies. "You made it," Clara said. "Said I would." "Mom'll be glad." Clara glanced toward the center of the room and back. "It's something tonight, isn't it?" Nora followed her glance. Dorothea Crane had moved closer to Brock Hayes and was speaking with an animation that looked, from a distance, like warmth. "Something," Nora agreed. Chessing. The thing about Dorothea Crane was that she was not stupid. Nora had been aware of this for years, had in fact repaired 3 of Dorothea's gowns at various points, brought to her cabin wrapped in cloth by Dorothea's household girl, with careful instructions about stitching and a price offered that was fair enough to be slightly surprising. Dorothea was a woman who had learned early that intelligence was more useful than it looked and had spent her adult life proving it. She'd kept her late husband's cattle operation profitable through 2 bad years and 1 serious drought, had negotiated a water rights agreement that her neighbors still talked about with a mixture of admiration and irritation, and had raised 2 sons who were, by all accounts, not disasters. What Dorothea wanted now, it was clear to anyone paying attention, was Brock Hayes' ranch attached to her own holdings. The emotional components of the arrangement were presumably negotiable. Margaret Whitmore's motivations were similar, but her methods were different. Where Dorothea operated through competence and directness, Margaret operated through the kind of relentless social charm that fills a room without ever seeming to push. She had a laugh that carried, a memory for names that made people feel important, and an instinct for the right compliment delivered at the right moment that Nora privately thought was its own kind of skill, even if she found it exhausting to watch. Helen Bassett, for her part, seemed to operate primarily through being very pretty, and making sure everyone in the room was aware of this fact at all times. There were people Nora knew for whom this was sufficient strategy. Whether Brock Hayes was one of those people remained, at this point, an open question. Nora cut pie. She handed plates to people who came to the table. She listened to the fiddle, which had been joined by a second and was now managing something closer to music. Nora Whitaker. She turned. Dorothea Crane was standing 3 feet away, which was close enough to be intentional. Margaret Whitmore was a step behind her, and the expression on Margaret's face was the kind that gets assembled quickly and is meant to look neutral but lands somewhere in the neighborhood of amused. "Mrs. Crane," Nora said, "can I get you some pie?" "I didn't come for pie." Dorothea looked at her steadily. She wasn't being cruel yet. That would come later, Nora understood, if at all. Right now, she was simply assessing. "I heard you were coming tonight. I wanted to see for myself." "Here I am," Nora said. "Yes." Something moved across Dorothea's face. "You look—" She paused with the delicacy of someone choosing a word carefully. "Comfortable." It was a masterful small cruelty. Nora gave her the point. "I'm always comfortable," she said. "It's one of my better qualities." Margaret laughed, which might or might not have been genuine. "We've seen you at these gatherings before," she said. "You always stay near the food table." "Someone has to." "Of course," Margaret smiled. "It's generous of you. I'm sure Pearl appreciates the help." The word help landed with a particular weight. Nora heard what was under it. Servant. Hired girl. The person who does the work while the real guests enjoy the evening. She looked at Margaret Whitmore steadily, and Margaret held the look, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Helen Bassett drifted over, having apparently decided the conversation was worth joining, and the dynamic shifted. "Is this the seamstress?" Helen asked. Not quite to Dorothea, not quite to Nora. It was the kind of question people ask when they already know the answer and want it confirmed in front of an audience. "Nora Whitaker," Nora said. "I'm aware of my own name, if that helps." Helen blinked. She had not expected directness. "I just meant—" "I know what you meant." Nora handed a plate of pie to a passing rancher without looking away. "Was there something you needed?" "I've got work to do." Helen's pretty face arranged itself into something that looked like offense, but was probably closer to confusion. She was not accustomed to being addressed this way by someone in a patched dress who was cutting pie at a side table. She looked at Dorothea. Dorothea looked at Nora. "You know," Dorothea said, and there was something almost like respect in her tone before she killed it, "there are easier ways to spend your Saturday evenings. There's no shame in knowing your place." "No," Nora agreed. "There isn't, and I know mine well enough." She picked up the pie knife and went back to work. Sit. She didn't think he'd heard any of it. He was across the room, still in conversation, and the noise of the gathering had risen enough in the past hour that a low exchange near the food table wouldn't have carried. But an hour later, when she was carrying an empty dish toward the kitchen area at the back, she nearly walked into him. He stepped aside. She stepped aside. They both chose the same direction, as people do, and for a moment they were standing directly in front of each other with approximately 2 feet between them and no polite way to pretend otherwise. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She had her empty dish. He had a cup of something she thought was probably cider. "Excuse me. Your pearls help tonight?" She looked at him. The question was exactly the same one Margaret Whitmore had implied, but the way he said it was different. Not a diminishment, just information gathering, the way you'd ask someone what time they'd arrived. "I offered to help, yes." He nodded. "She mentioned you might." He looked at the dish in her hands, then back at her face. "You made the apple pies." She had. "Pearl told you that?" "She said one of them was yours, and I should try it first. I thought she was just being kind, but it turned out to be specific advice." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and was gone. They were the best ones on the table. Nora was not a woman who blushed easily. She had spent too many years handling difficult conversations with ranch hands who came to her cabin at all hours needing work done. Too many years negotiating fair prices with people who started negotiations by assuming they could pay her less than her work was worth. She was not, generally speaking, rattled by a man's opinion. She felt color in her face anyway, which annoyed her. "Thank you," she said. "The secret is in the crust. Most people rush it." He seemed to find this genuinely interesting. "What do you do differently?" "Keep the butter colder than you think you need to and don't work it too long. And a little bit of vinegar in the water, my mother's method." "Your mother was a cook?" "My mother made do," Nora said. "She was very good at it." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone thinking rather than someone searching for something to say. "I knew your father a little," he said, "before he passed." "Good man." "He was," she said, because it was true, and because it was simpler than the fuller truth, which was that her father had been a good man who had been defeated by the land and by circumstance, and by a persistent inability to believe that either of those things would eventually let him rest. "You've been running the cabin yourself since then?" 4 years. She shifted the dish. "I do all right." He looked like he believed her. There was nothing in the look that suggested pity, which she appreciated enormously, having been on the receiving end of pity's many faces often enough to recognize all of them. "I imagine you do," he said. From across the room she was aware of Dorothea Crane watching them. She was aware of Margaret Whitmore noticing that Dorothea was watching. She was aware of Helen Bassett turning to see what the other two had found interesting. She didn't particularly care, but she was aware. "I should get this back," she said, meaning the dish. "Of course." He moved aside properly this time. "Good evening, Miss Whitaker." "Mr. Hayes?" She walked toward the kitchen and did not look back, which took a small amount of effort she would not have admitted to anyone. The evening came apart in stages, the way these things do. It started with a comment from Helen Bassett that carried farther than she'd intended, or maybe intended to carry exactly as far as it did, which with Helen was sometimes hard to determine. Nora had come back to the food table from the kitchen and was standing near the end, hands free for the moment, watching the dancing that had finally gotten going properly. Helen was 3 feet to her left in conversation with a young rancher's wife, and her voice had the particular projection of someone accustomed to being listened to. Can't imagine what she expects to accomplish, honestly, Helen was saying. There's being practical, and then there's being oblivious. One has to know when one is simply out of her depth. Nora understood immediately that she was the subject, and that Helen understood she was close enough to hear. This was the second kind of cruelty. Not the direct kind Dorothea employed, but the kind that requires an audience and operates through deniability. The rancher's wife, a young woman named Beth Culver, who'd been in Red Hollow only 2 years and still found its social architecture confusing, looked uncomfortable. I think she's been very helpful with the food. Oh, certainly, Helen agreed warmly. That's exactly what I mean. It's the right use of one's talents, isn't it? Not everyone is suited for the same things. There's dignity in knowing what one is suited for. Nora picked up an empty plate from the table and set it aside. She thought about saying something. She thought about several things she could say, ranging from controlled to uncontrolled, and measured each one against what it would cost her and what it would gain. In her experience, the cost was usually higher than it looked. She settled on nothing, which was what she usually settled on, because she'd learned long ago that silence was more durable than response, and that her reputation was built on her work and not her reactions. But Beth Culver turned to her with the slightly panicked eyes of someone who has just realized they are standing in the middle of something they don't understand and said, "Nora, do you know Helen Bassett? She came from Cincinnati." "We've met," Nora said. Helen looked at her. Her expression was practiced pleasantness. "Miss Whitaker, are you enjoying the evening?" "Well enough." Nora kept her voice level. "Yourself?" "It's charming," Helen said. "These frontier gatherings have such character." She said the word the way you say something that means almost the opposite of what it means, though I confess I don't quite understand some of the local customs. "Which ones are giving you trouble?" Something shifted in Helen's expression, a small recalibration. She hadn't expected the question asked that simply, without heat. "Well," she said, "I suppose I'm still learning who belongs where." "Most people figure it out eventually," Nora said. She looked around the room at the dancers and the people talking and the children who had finally been corralled into a corner by an exhausted-looking grandmother. "Takes a while sometimes." Helen opened her mouth and closed it. The rancher's wife looked relieved that the conversation appeared to be ending. Nora picked up a cloth and wiped down the table section in front of her, and after a moment Helen drifted away. It was Dorothea who finally said it out loud. It happened near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the music had slowed to the kind of late-night songs people dance to when they're tired but don't want to stop. Nora was stacking dishes near the kitchen, and Dorothea had come to retrieve a shawl she'd left near the food table, and they were briefly alone in that corner of the room while everyone else's attention was elsewhere. "I want to be honest with you," Dorothea said, and her voice had dropped the performance of pleasantness she'd maintained all evening. "Because I think you're intelligent enough to deserve it." Nora straightened from the dishes. "All right, whatever you're imagining might happen," Dorothea glanced across the room, not in Brock Hayes' direction, but in a way that made it clear she meant him anyway. "It won't. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because this is how the world works, Nora. Some doors open from the inside and some don't open at all. The sooner a person understands which is which, the easier her life is." She wasn't being cruel exactly. She was being something Nora found harder to deal with, which was certain. She believed what she was saying. She had probably believed it for so long that it had stopped being an opinion and become a fact. Nora looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for the advice," she said. Dorothea waited for more. When it didn't come, something that might have been frustration passed across her face. "You're not going to argue." "No." "Why not?" "Because you might be right," Nora said. "I don't know how things are going to go. Neither do you." She went back to the dishes. "But I'm going to keep being who I am and doing what I do, and the world can sort itself out around that. It usually does." Dorothea stood there a moment longer. Then she picked up her shawl and walked away, and Nora didn't watch her go. She was hitching her mule to the wagon outside when the barn door opened behind her. She was tired and her feet hurt, and she was thinking about nothing more dramatic than getting home, making tea, and sleeping. "Miss Whitaker." She turned. Brock Hayes stood a few feet away, hat in hand now that he'd finally remembered to take it off. The night was cool, and the stars were very clear in the way they get when the season starts turning. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I wanted to—" He stopped, started again. "I heard some of what was said earlier, near the food table. I wasn't trying to listen. The room just—" "It doesn't matter," she said. "It does." There was something in his voice that wasn't what she'd expected. Not pity, still not that, but something more complicated. "I want you to know I don't think—" "You don't have to tell me what you think," she said, and she said it gently rather than sharply. "I don't need you to correct anyone on my behalf. I've been managing that particular situation most of my life." She checked the hitch and found it good. "I'm not telling you that to be difficult. I'm just telling you what's true." He was quiet for a moment. In a different man, it would have been the quiet of not knowing what to say. In him, it was the quiet of thinking about it. "You're a proud woman," he said. "Not particularly." She came around to the side of the wagon. "I'm a specific woman. There's a difference. Pride is about feelings. Being specific is just knowing what you are and aren't." "And what aren't you?" She looked at him across the side of the wagon, in the cool dark with the noise of the gathering bleeding out from the barn behind them. "I'm not someone who needs to be saved from the opinions of women in expensive dresses," she said. "I knew what tonight would look like before I walked in. I walked in anyway because I told Pearl I would help. That's—" he started and stopped himself. "What?" "Stubborn," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he meant it more as an observation than a criticism. "Probably," she agreed. She climbed up to the wagon seat. "Good night, Mr. Hayes." He stepped back to give her room. "Good night, Miss Whitaker." He paused. The pie really was exceptional. She almost laughed. She didn't, quite. "Don't tell Dorothea Crane you think so," she said. "She'll add it to the list of reasons I'm dangerous." She drove off into the dark before she could see whether he smiled at that. And the stars were very bright overhead all the way home, and she told herself she didn't think about the conversation again. She thought about it twice more before she fell asleep. Her cabin sat on the eastern edge of the Whitaker land, what was left of it, which was the cabin itself and about 40 acres that her father had held on to through everything because he couldn't bear to sell the parcel where he'd built the original structure. The rest had gone over the years, section by section, through hard seasons and medical debts, and the one terrible winter when they'd lost every animal they had and had survived on credit and other people's charity, which her father had accepted with a shame that had lasted longer than the winter did. The 40 acres were enough. She had a kitchen garden that supplied most of what she ate. She raised 4 chickens and 2 geese, more trouble than they were worth most of the time, but impossible to get rid of because she'd had the geese since they were young, and they followed her around with an attachment she found both touching and inconvenient. She took in sewing, not just mending, but the more complex work, the things that required patience and precision, the wedding dresses and formal alterations, and the occasional piece of custom work for a rancher's wife who wanted something she couldn't get from the dry goods catalog. She was good at it. She was, though she'd rarely have said so out loud, extremely good at it, in the way that happens when you've spent 15 years at something because you had no other choice and precision became its own reward. She also did things that weren't strictly sewing, helped with the books for 2 of the smaller ranches. When their owners ran into trouble they didn't want to admit to a banker, advised on a legal dispute about fence lines using knowledge she'd absorbed from her father's papers after his death, helped Pearl Holloway organize the autumn gathering for the past 6 years. None of this paid much. All of it paid something. The morning after the gathering, she woke early and found 2 of her chickens had gotten out and were attempting to establish a new life under the porch steps. She spent 40 minutes dealing with that, which put her in a mood, and then made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the mending work she had due back to the Alvarez family by the end of the week. She was thinking about the drought. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, honestly, since early August, when the creek that ran through the eastern quarter of her land had dropped to a level she'd never seen before, and the soil in her kitchen garden had started cracking in ways it didn't usually crack until October. The wells around Red Hollow were down too. She knew this because she listened, because she talked to the ranch hands who came to her with their mending and who, in the way of people who worked physical jobs and spent their days in company they couldn't easily escape, needed to talk to someone who would hear them without judgment. The Emery Ranch's east well was nearly dry. The Culver place was hauling water from the river daily, which was exhausting and barely adequate. The Hayes spread, from what she'd heard, was better positioned than most. Brock Hayes had invested 3 years ago in deepening his main wells and installing storage tanks, a decision that had seemed like unnecessary expense at the time and now looked prescient. But even the Hayes water reserves had limits, and the season wasn't turning. The clouds came and looked heavy and moved on. She threaded her needle and worked through the morning, and she thought about water, and she thought about what happened to a community when the thing it depended on became uncertain. And she thought, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, about the way Brock Hayes had looked at her across the side of a wagon in the dark with the stars overhead, saying exceptional about a pie that was, in fact, exceptional, and meaning it. She concentrated on her stitching. The geese made noise outside. The coffee went cold. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor in its usual slow way, and Nora Whitaker sat in it and thought about drought and pie and stubbornness, and whether being specific about who you were was enough to hold a life together when the world began to shift under your feet. She thought it probably was. She had always thought so. She was less certain this particular morning than she'd been the morning before, and she couldn't entirely account for why. Outside, the sky was cloudless, and the sun was very bright, and not a drop of rain was coming. The drought did not announce itself. That was the thing about it. It arrived slowly, the way debt does, each day slightly worse than the one before, until you looked up one morning and realized the situation had passed from difficult into something that didn't have a comfortable name. By the third week of September, Nora had stopped checking the creek level every morning, because checking it had become a way of feeling worse without gaining any useful information. The water was down. It stayed down. Checking it daily only gave her a precise measurement of how bad the thing she couldn't fix had gotten. She stopped checking and started doing what she could, which was extending the garden's water further by carrying buckets from the creek at dusk, when the evaporation rate was lower, setting out every container she owned when the clouds came through on false promise nights, and cutting back the geese's water ration in a way they made their feelings about very clearly. The town felt it differently than she did. Her 40 acres were enough of a concern on their own, but for the ranches, the operations that had real money tied up in cattle and feed, and the careful seasonal math of a working frontier spread, the drought was financial. She heard it in the voices of the men who came to her with torn work clothes, the particular tight quality a man's voice gets when he's trying to talk about something ordinary while carrying something else entirely. 3 of the east wells are down past useful, Tom Emery told her one afternoon, sitting on her porch step while she worked on a split seam in his good jacket. The one he wore to town, not the work one. Tom was 47 and had been running the Emery spread since his father handed it over a decade ago. He was not a man who complained easily, which meant when he talked about difficulty, he was generally talking about something real. We're hauling twice a day and the cattle are still showing it. You can see it in them. Animals know when something's wrong before people do. They do, Nora agreed. Hayes is all right for now. He said it without bitterness, which she respected. Those storage tanks he put in, people thought he was being, I don't know, fancy. But he was just thinking ahead. That's sometimes what fancy looks like from the outside. Tom was quiet a moment. You haven't had trouble? Up here? Some. She kept her eyes on the stitching. I'm managing. You'd say that anyway. Probably. He looked out at the dry land. Something else too, he said, and his voice changed. Not quieter exactly, but more careful. Lost 6 head last week. Found 3 of them 2 miles east through the Garner fence. Gate was down. Figured it was the wind or the cattle pushed it. But then Davy Alvarez said he'd lost some too, and his fence line was cut. Nora's needle paused. Cut. Clean through, not a break. Wire doesn't break clean like that. She looked up at him. Did he tell Hayes? Word gets around, but there's nothing to point at yet. Might be a coincidence. He didn't say it like he believed it. Just, you're out here on your own. Thought you should know things are a little unsettled. She thanked him and finished his jacket and watched him drive back toward the main road, and she sat with the information for the rest of the afternoon while she worked. Cut wire was not drought and not weather. Cut wire was a person making a decision. Mutt. She started paying attention differently after that. It was a skill she'd developed over years of managing alone. The ability to listen past the surface of a conversation to what was actually being said, to notice the things people mentioned once and then moved away from because they were uncomfortable or because they didn't know what to make of them. She had good ears, and she was the kind of woman people talked to, partly because she didn't repeat things without reason, and partly because her cabin was a stop between the ranches and the town, and people often found themselves there in the middle of doing something else. Over the next 2 weeks, what she collected added up. The Alvarez wire cutting wasn't isolated. 3 other ranches along the eastern corridor had reported missing cattle. Not mass losses, not the kind of thing that obviously constituted theft, but consistent small disappearances that could be individually explained and collectively couldn't. A supply wagon from Dorchester heading to the Whitmore Ranch had been delayed 2 days by a road obstruction that the driver said looked arranged rather than accidental. Bales of feed stored at the Emery Ranch's north barn had been soaked. A roof problem, Emery said, but the timing of the damage suggested someone had helped the weather along. She turned it over in her mind at night, working on the pieces of it the way she worked on a complicated alteration, looking for the logic underneath, the structure that made sense of the individual parts. Someone was applying pressure. Slow, quiet, plausibly deniable pressure. Not destroying the ranches, just wearing at them, making the drought harder, making the operations more expensive to run, making people uncertain and tired. She thought about who benefited from that. She thought about land. When a frontier operation failed, the land went somewhere. Usually it went to whoever was positioned to make the acquisition, whoever had cash reserves or credit or relationships with the right people at the county office. She thought about who in 3 counties had all 3 of those things, and she thought about which properties would become significantly more valuable if the water situation resolved itself, as it eventually would. She thought about Earl Grady. Grady ran a land acquisition operation out of the county seat 30 miles north, and he operated in the specific way that men who understand the gap between legal and right operate, carefully, through intermediaries, with paperwork that was technically in order and outcomes that were technically legitimate, and a pattern that only became visible when you looked at enough of it together. She'd never had a transaction with him directly, but she'd heard enough to have formed a view, and her view was that he was patient and methodical and not overly burdened by principle. She didn't have proof. She had logic, which wasn't the same thing, and she had the accumulated weight of too many small things in too short a time, which also wasn't proof, but was the kind of thing that should probably be said out loud to someone who could do something about it. She drove into town on a Wednesday and went to see Sheriff Aldis, who was a decent enough man laboring under the significant disadvantage of believing that problems announced themselves clearly before they became serious. "Nora," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I've heard the Alvarez complaint and the Emery situation, but I can't open an investigation based on a pattern you've noticed. I'd need something concrete." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not asking you to open an investigation. I'm asking you to be aware that it might be worth watching." "I'm always watching." She looked at him. "Are you?" He shifted. He was not a man who responded well to being questioned directly, but he was also not a dishonest man, and he knew she wasn't being aggressive. Just asking. "I'll keep my ears open," he said, which was probably the most she was going to get. She thanked him and left and went to the dry goods store for the supplies she'd needed to come in for anyway, and on her way out, she nearly walked into Dorothea Crane for the 2nd time in a month. Dorothea looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. "You're in town for supplies," she said, as though this were slightly surprising. "And other business," Nora said. "Other business." Dorothea held her parcels and tilted her head slightly. You're not putting yourself forward about the Hayes matter, are you?" It was phrased like a question. It wasn't really a question. Nora looked at her steadily. "I'm not putting myself forward about anything," she said. "I have my own work to see to." "Yes." Something moved behind Dorothea's eyes. "I just thought after the gathering." "The gathering was a gathering," Nora said. "Good day, Mrs. Crane." She walked to her wagon and drove home, and she was halfway there before she registered that Dorothea had looked something other than confident. She'd looked, for just a moment, worried. Not about Nora specifically, about something else. Nora filed that away with everything else. The storm came from the northwest on a Saturday night in early October, which the frontier regularly produced as though to remind people that the absence of rain for 6 weeks was not a promise, but simply a delay before it decided to make up the difference all at once. It hit the Hayes Ranch hardest, which was geography as much as bad luck. The spread sat on open ground that gave the wind nothing to break against before it arrived. She heard about it the next morning from Davy Alvarez's son Miguel, who was 15 and had been riding fences for the Alvarez operation since he was 12, and knew every property in the area the way children know the geography of places they've spent years in. "Part of the north paddock fence is completely down," Miguel told her. He was standing at her door with his horse tied at the post, sent by his father to ask if she had spare wire to loan. The Alvarez supply had already been used patching their own storm damage. Mr. Hayes had cattle get out. They found most of them, but not all. And one of the hay storage structures, the east one, the roof came half off. They're working it now, but it's a lot of people dealing with a lot of things at the same time. Process après ichen. How many hands does he have on today? Miguel shrugged. Regular number. Some men from the Emery place went over to help. But it's a big operation. Nora stood in her doorway and thought about it. She didn't have spare wires. Her own fences had taken some damage, and she'd used what she had that morning. But she had other things. She knew which of the hands across the ranches had done what kind of work, knew who among them had experience with structural repair versus fence work, knew the terrain of the Hayes property well enough from years of delivering mending directly when the order was too large to wait for someone to pick up. She told Miguel she'd see what she could do. She drove to the Emery place first and talked to Tom, who confirmed he'd sent 4 men over and could spare 2 more if she could get the message to them by noon. She stopped at the Alvarez spread and talked to Davy, whose family had been in the county 3 generations and who had connections to 2 other small operations to the south that she didn't. By mid-morning, she had 7 additional men willing to help. A cart of lumber that the Garner operation had sitting from a project that had stalled, and a list in her head of who should be doing what. She was not trying to be heroic. She was trying to be useful, which was different, though people confuse the two sometimes. When she arrived at the Hayes Ranch, it was organized chaos, which is to say it was chaos with people attempting organization without quite enough information about who had what skills or where the most critical problems were. She found the foreman, a big man named Curtis, who had a look of someone managing 12 things simultaneously and succeeding at about 8 of them. Whitaker, he said, which was how he referred to everyone, first name or last depending apparently on some internal system she'd never decoded. "You came out. Brought some help." She listed who was behind her and what they could do. Curtis stared at her for a moment. "How'd you get Garner's lumber?" I asked. He absorbed this. "The east structure's the priority," he said. "Roof's going to come off completely if we don't get it shored up before tonight. We've got men on fence to the north to get the cattle secure. The south pasture gate needs repair, and there are 3 animals we haven't located." "Where were they last accounted?" He pointed roughly northeast. "Broke through the fence there, we think. That's rough ground up toward the creek." She knew that ground. She'd walked it in better seasons when the creek had been worth walking to. "I'll look for them." Curtis blinked. "You don't have to." "I know the terrain up there better than most of your men do," she said. "It's not complicated. Just needs someone who won't get turned around." She found 2 of the 3 missing cattle in a creek gully where the animals had gone looking for water and gotten themselves stuck in the soft bank. Getting them out took an hour and more effort than she'd anticipated. Cattle are heavy and stupid and convinced that the way out of a difficult situation is the wrong direction. And she came back to the ranch main area with mud to her elbows and a bruise forming on her right forearm where one of the animals had thrown its head at exactly the wrong moment. The 3rd animal turned up on its own, having apparently decided to walk home by a route nobody had predicted. She helped shore up the east structure for the rest of the afternoon, mostly doing what Curtis directed her to do and occasionally suggesting a different approach when the one being tried wasn't working, always framing it as a question rather than a correction, because men in the middle of physical crisis respond better to questions than to corrections, and she was not, despite what the morning had required of her, trying to run anyone's operation. She left before the light went completely, driving home in the blue early evening dark with mud drying on her arms, and her back aching, and her mind already moving to what needed doing at her own place before full dark. She didn't see Brock Hayes all day. He was somewhere on the property dealing with one of the dozen things that needed dealing with, and their paths didn't cross. And she didn't go looking. She'd come to help, not to be seen helping, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered to her more than she could have easily explained. It was only the next day, when Tom Emery came by with some of his men's mending and mentioned that Hayes had asked about her. Specifically, had asked Tom who organized all that help, because I didn't know there was a plan until it was already working, that she understood he had noticed. She found that she didn't know quite what to do with that information, so she set it aside and went back to her sewing, and outside the dry land showed its first tentative sign of change. A smell in the air, cold and faintly mineral, that people who'd grown up on the frontier recognized as the advance of weather that might this time actually arrive. The creek, when she checked it that evening for the first time in weeks, was exactly as low as it had been. But something felt different anyway, and she couldn't entirely have said why, only that the afternoon at the Hayes Ranch had left a residue she hadn't expected. The feeling, slightly unfamiliar, of having been useful in a way that was visible rather than quiet. Of having been part of something larger than her 40 acres and her geese and her careful solitary system for surviving. She didn't examine it too closely. She had work to do. The rain came 4 days after the storm, which was not enough rain and not enough time, but it was something. It settled the dust on the main road into town and brought the creek up 2 inches, which Nora noted without celebration because 2 inches was better than nothing and still not what the land needed. The geese were pleased about it. She was mildly pleased about it. The frontier required a specific emotional calibration around weather. Enough hope to keep working, not enough to be destroyed when the hope didn't pay out. And she'd been practicing that calibration long enough that it had become automatic. What hadn't become automatic was the way things had shifted, slightly and undeniably, after the day at the Hayes Ranch. It was small things. Curtis, the foreman, stopped by her cabin the following week with a parcel of mending from 3 of the hands, which was normal enough. But he lingered at the door longer than necessary and mentioned in the careful way of a man conveying information. He's been asked to convey, without making it obvious he's been asked, that the east structure was holding up well and the animal count was back to where it should be. She thanked him and he left, and she thought about who might have suggested he stop by in person rather than sending one of the younger men as he usually did. Davy Alvarez mentioned it more directly because Davy had never seen a point in indirection. "Hayes asked about you," he said, standing in her yard while she stacked firewood she'd cut that morning. "At the Emery place, when a few of us were over there. Asked how you were doing, asked if your fences had come through the storm all right." "My fences are fine," she said. "I told him that." He watched her stack. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. "That's his right." "Nora." He waited until she looked at him. Davy was 53 and had known her since she was a child, and had the particular standing of someone who had earned the right to say things directly. "The man is trying to find a reason to come by." "He doesn't need a reason," she said, and went back to the wood. He came by 11 days after the storm, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was doing something half-hearted with clouds that hadn't decided yet whether they were going to amount to anything. She was in the yard mending a leather harness that had cracked, sitting on the old stump she used as a work surface outside, when she heard a horse on the track and looked up. He dismounted at the gate rather than riding through, which she noticed. It was a small courtesy, not assuming access, and it registered. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She kept working. "You can come through." He came through and stood a reasonable distance away with his hat in his hands, which was apparently where his hat lived when he was at any kind of disadvantage. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you organized after the storm. Tom and Davy deserve most of the credit. They sent the men." "You organized it." He said it like a fact, not a compliment. "Curtis told me. Said there was a plan already working before most people had figured out there was a problem." She glanced up. "It wasn't complicated. It was just matching what people had to what was needed. I know most of the operations around here. You know a lot of things about a lot of operations." He said it thoughtfully, not as an accusation, more than most people realize. She set the harness down across her knee. "I've been in this county my whole life, and people have been talking to me about their problems my whole life. You pick things up." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the yard, the cabin, the garden that was still producing despite the drought because she'd worked it carefully. Taking it in without performing appreciation, just actually looking. She found that she didn't mind being seen by him the way she minded it from other people. "I heard you talk to Aldous," he said, "about the wire cutting and the rest of it." She felt something tighten. Did he tell you that? No, someone else did. He met her eyes. You think it's connected? The supply route trouble, the fence cuts, the feed damage. I think it's worth considering. So do I. He was quiet a moment. I've been thinking about Grady. She looked at him more fully. What made you land on Grady? The timing. His jaw shifted. There's a water rights assessment coming up in November. County level. Whoever holds the most viable land at the time of assessment gets first consideration for the new reservoir allocation. If 2 or 3 of the eastern operations are struggling when that assessment happens, the land values shift, she said, and anyone positioned to acquire at distressed prices before the assessment comes out of it with rights they didn't earn. He said it flatly. The flatness was where the anger was. I can't prove it. Neither can I, she said. I told Aldous to watch. That's all I could do with what I had. He nodded. He was close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes properly. Not just the weathering, but the specific kind of tiredness that comes from carrying responsibility for something you've built and being aware of how many ways it could come apart. She understood that tiredness from a different angle, from smaller stakes, but she understood it. The Frontier Ball is in 3 weeks, he said, and the shift in subject was abrupt enough that she paused. I know, she said carefully. I'd like you to be there. He said it without elaboration, which forced her to decide what it meant. She looked at him for a moment. I'm usually there, she said. I help Pearl with the food. Something moved across his face. Frustration, maybe, at his own lack of clarity, or at the situation that made clarity complicated. I'd like you to be there as a guest, he said. Not working the food table. As a guest. The yard was very quiet. One of the geese had wandered around the side of the cabin and was regarding Brock Hayes with the specific suspicion geese reserved for strangers. That's going to cause a considerable amount of difficulty, Nora said. I know. Dorothea Crane alone will make it. I know, he said again. I'm not asking you to manage the difficulty. I'm just asking if you'll come. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. He wasn't performing patience. He was just waiting, and the difference between those two things was, as she'd noted before about him, real. I'll come, she said, but I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's going to happen when I walk in. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, he said. I never have. Eat. The Frontier Ball was held at the Holloway Barn on the last Saturday of October, which Pearl had expanded for the occasion by opening the adjoining storage structure and stringing lights between the 2 buildings. It was the largest social event in the Red Hollow calendar and had been for as long as anyone could remember. The one night when the Frontier's various strata put on their best clothes and occupied the same space and pretended, with varying degrees of success, that the strata didn't exist. Nora wore the dress she'd made herself 2 years ago for a cousin's wedding. Dark green wool with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved properly. The kind of dress that didn't apologize for itself without shouting. She'd let out the side seams slightly and replaced the buttons with a set she'd been keeping in her sewing box for the right occasion, dark horn buttons that caught light without being decorative. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror and thought, not fine, but good, honest, herself. She arrived at the same time as 3 of the Alvarez family, which was probably not an accident since Davy had mentioned he'd be coming early, and she walked in with them rather than alone, which was practical and also, she admitted to herself, slightly less like walking into something she knew was going to be difficult. The room had already arranged itself by the time she got there. Dorothea Crane near the center in deep burgundy, diamonds at her throat, real ones, nobody doubted it. Margaret Whitmore in cream silk, her dark hair elaborate. Helen Bassett in a shade of gold that worked extremely well with her coloring and that she was clearly aware of. They were positioned like 3 points of a careful geometry, each within sight of the others and of the main entrance, and of the spot near the far wall where Brock Hayes stood talking to 3 of the county ranchers. He saw her when she walked in. She didn't look for him specifically, but she knew when it happened because of the slight shift in the room's attention. The way Dorothea's gaze tracked from the door and then moved quickly to Hayes and then back again, reading the connection. Nora went to find Pearl. You look lovely, Pearl said, gripping both her hands. Pearl was 71 and had stopped being interested in social politics roughly 40 years ago and was therefore the most honest person in the room. That green is exactly right for you. Don't make a fuss, Nora said, because Pearl's warmth always made her slightly uncomfortable in the way that genuine warmth from unexpected quarters does. "I'll make whatever fuss I like," Pearl said. "Now go enjoy yourself. Clara is handling the food table tonight. You're not working." The evening moved the way these evenings do. In currents and eddies, conversations starting and shifting, the music rising and falling, the specific social choreography of a small community that knows all its own tensions and is performing around them. Nora talked to Beth Culver, who was relieved to see her and introduced her to a young couple from the Garner operation she hadn't met properly. She talked to Tom Emery about the water situation. She accepted a cup of cider from someone whose name she couldn't remember and found a spot near the side wall that was comfortable without being hidden. She was aware of being watched. She was aware of Dorothea Crane watching her in particular, with the focused attention of someone who has identified a variable they hadn't adequately accounted for and is now recalculating. She was aware of Margaret Whitmore saying something to Helen Bassett behind her fan, an actual fan in October, indoors, and of Helen's eyes moving briefly to her before moving away. She was aware, too, of Brock Hayes moving through the room and of the fact that he was not moving toward her, which was either consideration or something else. She couldn't tell which and told herself it didn't matter. Then, at 9:30, things that had been held in a kind of suspended tension began to move. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing. A sound beneath the music and the conversation, low and wrong. The specific quality of noise that doesn't belong indoors and registers in the body before the mind catches up. She saw it in the faces of the people near the east wall first, the slight alerting in their posture, the heads turning. Smoke. Not much, not yet. A smell more than a presence. The particular smell of something dry burning that wasn't a fireplace. Then someone came through the side door at a run, and the word barn was in his mouth, and the room changed. She was moving before she'd consciously decided to move, which was not heroism, but reflex. The product of a lifetime of being the person who dealt with things rather than waited for someone else to deal with them. She went through the side door and saw it. The main barn, 40 yards from the gathering structure, with fire working along its east face and 3 figures on horseback at the far edge of the lamplight, driving hard away from the property into the dark. She didn't run for the barn. She ran for the equipment yard because she knew the Hayes property from her visit during the storm, and she knew that the irrigation channel Curtis had pointed out, the old one, dug before the storage tanks, running from the higher ground, had its sluice gate 30 yards south of where she was standing. She also knew it hadn't been used in years, and the gate mechanism might not move. It moved. It was stiff, and required both hands and a significant amount of force, and one very long moment when she was certain it was seized completely. And then something gave with a grinding complaint, and the gate opened and the water came down the channel in a low, urgent surge toward the barn's east face. It wasn't enough to put the fire out. She hadn't expected it to be. But it slowed it, hit the burning face of the structure with enough pressure to push the fire back from the door and the paddock fence line, and by the men now running from the gathering the time they needed to form a bucket line from the water tank on the west side. It took 40 minutes. Parts of the east wall were gone, and the roof above them was badly damaged, and 3 men were burned on their hands and arms, none seriously. 17 cattle had been driven from the paddock into the back pasture by the men on horseback before anyone got outside, and it would take until morning to find them all. Nora was at the sluice gate when the fire was mostly out, sitting on the ground with her back against the gatepost because her arms were shaking from the effort, and she hadn't quite noticed until she stopped. Her dress was ruined. She was aware of this in the distant, practical way of someone who made her own clothes and understood both the cost and the labor, and had already mentally set it aside as done. She heard footsteps and looked up. Brock Hayes stood in front of her. His jacket was gone and his shirt was marked with ash, and he had the expression of a man who has just watched something he built be damaged and is still in the process of taking stock of what's left. He looked at her hands, her ruined dress, the open sluice gate, the channel still running. "The irrigation channel," he said. "It was the fastest option. I knew where the gate was from the storm work." She looked at her hands. "It might need some maintenance after this." The mechanism was not happy. He crouched down in front of her so they were at eye level. "Are you hurt?" "No." She thought about it. "My arms are tired. The gate was stiff." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down on the ground beside her, which was not what she'd expected, and for a while neither of them said anything. The bucket line was disbanding behind them, men moving with the exhausted, purposeful quiet that follows physical crisis. Someone was talking to the 3 burned men near the water tank. Curtis was shouting something about the pasture count. "The men on horseback," she said. 3 of them. "I know. This wasn't opportunistic. The timing, the ball," he said. "Every rancher in the county in one place. Maximum disruption, minimum chance of a fast response." He said it with the flatness of someone who has already run the logic and arrived at the conclusion. "Grady, you can't prove it." "No." His voice was quiet. "Not yet." She was aware that behind them, at the gathering structure, people had come out and were standing at a distance watching, the way people do when a crisis has passed and the processing of it hasn't started yet. She was aware of Dorothea Crane at the edge of the crowd. She could see her dark shape in the lamplight, and of other shapes she didn't try to identify. "You should go back," she said. "They need you organizing the pasture recovery." In a minute, he didn't move. That was fast thinking. The gate. It occurred to me. It didn't occur to anyone else. He looked at the ground between them. "I've been watching you for weeks," he said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded and added, I've been..." He stopped. That came out wrong. Despite everything, despite the ruined dress and the shaking arms and the smoke smell that was going to be in her hair for days, she felt something almost like the impulse to laugh. "I know what you meant. I've been trying to find an occasion," he said, "that didn't feel contrived, or like I was using something as an excuse, like a conversation about pie. That wasn't contrived." "No," she said. "It wasn't." She looked at her hands, then at him. "You should go." He stood up and offered her his hand, which she took, not because she needed it to stand, but because it was offered simply and without performance, and she'd learned to recognize that quality in people and value it when she found it. He pulled her up, and for a moment they were standing close in the dark beside the running irrigation channel with the smoke smell around them and the sounds of the ranch resettling around them. "Come back inside," he said. "When you're ready. The evening isn't over." She thought about the state of her dress. She thought about the crowd near the gathering structure. She thought about Dorothea Crane's dark shape and Margaret Whitmore and Helen Bassett and what the walk back in would look like. "All right," she said. She took a few minutes at the water tank to clean her hands and face as well as she could manage, which wasn't entirely well, and then she walked back to the gathering structure with her dress in its ruined state and her hair loosened from the smoke and her arms still faintly unsteady, and she walked through the door and the room saw her. The music had stopped. People were still processing the night. Some had ash on their sleeves. The burned men had been brought inside and were being tended. A low electric hum of reaction and recovery ran through the crowd. But when Nora walked in, something shifted. Heads turned. The specific quality of a room's attention moved. She found a spot near the wall and stood there while the room resettled, and she was thinking about the men on horseback and the irrigation gate and the water rights assessment in November, working through it the way she worked through a complicated problem, not aware that she was the thing the room was most interested in until the music started again and Brock Hayes came across the floor. He came straight across. Not circling, not approaching indirectly, straight across the room through the crowd that moved slightly to make room without people quite noticing they'd moved. Dorothea Crane was 10 feet to his left, and he didn't look at her. Margaret Whitmore was closer, and he walked past her as though she were furniture, not dismissively, just not the direction he was going. He stopped in front of Nora and held out his hand. Not the way you offer a hand to help someone stand up. The way you offer a hand to someone you want to dance with at a gathering where the music is playing and the whole town is watching. The room had gone very quiet. Nora looked at his hand. She looked at him. His face was ash-marked and tired and entirely certain, which was not the same as comfortable. She could see it cost him something to stand there in front of everyone. But he wasn't performing the certainty. It was just there. The way convictions that have been arrived at honestly tend to be. She thought about Dorothea telling her that some doors don't open from the outside. She thought about the cracked mirror in her cabin and the twice-mended shoulder seam and her mother's method for pie crust and 40 acres of dry land that she'd worked and kept and called her own when it would have been easier to let it go. She took his hand. The room stayed quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable, which was the sound of an entire community revising its understanding of a situation, and then the fiddle started up again, and Brock Hayes led Nora Whitaker onto the floor of the Holloway barn, and they danced while the smoke from his damaged barn still hung faintly in the October air outside, and nobody laughed. Not one person, and that silence was louder than anything that had been said all evening. The dance lasted 4 minutes. She counted, not because she was anxious to have it end, but because her mind did that, filed details, registered duration, kept inventory of things as a habit so old it had stopped being conscious. 4 minutes of the fiddle and Brock Hayes's hand steady at her back, and the room rearranging itself around the fact of them on the floor together. Then the song ended and they stepped apart and the ordinary noise of the evening resumed, slightly different than it had been before. The way a room sounds different after a window has been opened and then closed again. She went to sit with Pearl, who said nothing about any of it, and talked instead about the barrel situation in the kitchen, which was exactly what Nora needed. The ride home was cold and the dark was complete, and she sat in the wagon thinking about the men on horseback and the water rights assessment and the way a single evening could turn a person's understanding of their own life at an angle they hadn't anticipated. She was not a woman who catastrophized, but she was also not a woman who told herself comfortable untruths. And the comfortable untruth available to her right now was that what had happened on that dance floor was simple or uncomplicated or without consequence, and she knew it was none of those things. She also knew that the barn fire had been deliberate, that the men who'd set it were almost certainly connected to Earl Grady's operation, and that the water rights assessment was 3 weeks away. Whatever was building in Red Hollow had not finished building. She put the wagon in the shed and went inside and sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a while, which was something she did when she needed to think without the distraction of tasks. The geese were quiet for once. The wind had come up from the north, and she could hear it working at the corner of the cabin where the chinking had gone soft, a thing she'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. She thought about Dorothea Crane's face when Brock crossed the floor. She hadn't looked at Dorothea directly. She'd been looking at his hand, and then at him, but she'd caught it in her peripheral vision, the specific arrangement of a woman's face when she has been comprehensively surprised by something she was certain couldn't happen. Not just disappointment, something that looked more like the moment of realizing a calculation you'd based a season's plans on was wrong in a fundamental way. She thought, not for the first time, that Dorothea Crane was not going to accept that quietly. She was right. By Monday, 2 days after the ball, the shape of the counter-narrative had become clear. It moved the way rumors move in small communities, not uniformly, but along specific lines of relationship, person to person, each telling carrying the same basic structure with minor variations depending on who was telling it. The structure was this. Nora Whitaker had positioned herself deliberately, had inserted herself into the storm recovery, the drought management, the barn fire situation, in order to manufacture proximity to Brock Hayes, had calculated it, had been, in some versions, actually manipulative about it in ways that the tellers left usefully vague. She heard it first from Beth Culver, who came to her on Monday afternoon with the specific, embarrassed energy of someone delivering news they don't want to be the messenger for, but feel obligated to share. "I think you should know what's being said," Beth told her, standing at the cabin door. "I don't believe any of it. I want to say that first." "Tell me," Nora said, Beth told her. She was thorough about it, which Nora appreciated, not softening it into something easier than it was. The version circulating in town had Nora as a strategic operator who had identified Brock Hayes as a target and run a months-long campaign to get his attention using manufactured crises as opportunities. The barn fire, in some tellings, had been almost suggested to have served her purposes conveniently. Nora listened to all of it without interrupting. When Beth finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to think about it." She thought about it for the rest of that day and most of the night. She thought about what the story required of her in response. Whether response was even the right tool, whether attempting to defend herself would only give the narrative more oxygen, whether the people who mattered were the ones currently repeating it or the ones who weren't. What she kept coming back to was not her own situation, but the water rights assessment. 3 weeks. Whatever Grady was doing, he was doing it on a timeline, and the social disruption being seeded through the widow's campaign whether they understood they were being useful to him or not, was a distraction. A good one. While people in Red Hollow were talking about Nora Whitaker's motives at the Frontier Ball, they weren't talking about the fence cuts and the feed damage and 3 men on horseback driving cattle away from a burning barn in the dark. She went to see Sheriff Aldous again on Tuesday morning, and this time she brought a piece of paper. She'd spent the previous night writing it out, the timeline, starting in August, of every incident she'd heard about across the Eastern Corridor ranches. The fence cut at Alvarez, the supply obstruction on the Dorchester Road, the feed damage at Emory, the missing cattle across 4 operations, the barn fire, the dates, the details, the properties affected, the financial impact as best she could estimate it. She'd organized it the way her father had organized his papers, the way she'd learned to organize information, not by how it felt, but by what it showed. Aldous read it across his desk without speaking. He was a slow reader, and she let him be slow. Outside the office window, the main street of Red Hollow went about its Tuesday morning business. When he finished, he looked up. "This is thorough," he said. "Yes? Some of these I knew about individually." He tapped the paper. "Not like this." "I know." He looked at the paper again. "Grady." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "That's a serious accusation, Nora." "I haven't accused him of anything," she said. "I've laid out a pattern. What you do with it is your business." He was quiet. He was doing the thing he did, which was processing the gap between what he wanted the situation to be and what it appeared to actually be. She had some patience for it because she understood it came from a genuine wish that the world was more orderly than it was, not from dishonesty. "The barn fire," he said. 3 riders. "You saw them?" "I saw their shapes. I couldn't identify anyone." "Anyone else get a look?" "You'd have to ask." She'd already asked quietly, among the people she trusted. Tom Emery's youngest hand had seen them for longer than she had, long enough to say that one of the horses was a distinctive pale roan, which was not common. She told Aldous this. He wrote it down. This was progress. "I'll make some inquiries," he said, which was the same thing he'd said before but landed differently this time, with more weight, as though the paper on his desk had changed the cost of saying it without meaning it. "There's a water rights assessment in 3 weeks," she said. "I know about the assessment. Whatever this is, it's time to that. The properties being affected are all Eastern Corridor, the ones that would factor into the allocation. If they're in distress when the assessment happens—" "I understand the logic," he said slightly sharply, which meant he'd already thought of it or was annoyed at himself for not thinking of it sooner. "I said I'll look into it." She left the paper with him and went home. Brock Hayes came to her cabin on Wednesday. He didn't send word first. She heard the horse and looked out and saw him at the gate again, hat off this time before he'd even come through, which she noted. She opened the door and he came to the porch, and she gestured to the 2 chairs she kept out there for the rare occasions when she sat outside for reasons other than work. "Aldous came to see me," he said, settling into the chair in the careful way of a tall man in furniture, built for someone shorter. "He mentioned you'd been in." "I had." "He showed me the paper you put together." He looked at her. "When did you do all that?" "Monday night." He absorbed this. "You'd been collecting it since August." "I'd been listening since August. Collecting is a stronger word than what I was doing." "What word would you use?" She thought about it. "Paying attention," she said. "It's not complicated. It's just, if you're in a room and someone's rearranging the furniture, eventually you notice the furniture has moved even if you never saw anyone touch it." He was quiet for a moment. The geese had appeared around the corner of the cabin and were regarding him with their usual suspicion. He looked at them, then back at her. "There was a pale roan horse," he said, "at Grady's operation. I saw it 3 months ago when I drove up there on county road business." His voice was level. "I didn't know that mattered until Aldous asked me about it this morning." She felt something settle, the specific feeling of a piece fitting into place. "Did you tell Aldous?" "Yes." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "Nora, this is going to get complicated. If Aldous pursues it, and it does connect to Grady, there'll be a legal process, and it'll be public, and it'll be messy. These things always are." "I know. You're already dealing with the other thing," he said, which was the first time either of them had acknowledged the social campaign directly. I know what's being said. I want you to know that It doesn't matter what you want me to know, she said, not unkindly. What matters is what's true. I didn't come to that barn because of you. I came because there were people who needed help, and I knew how to help them. If people want to make something else of it, they can. I can't stop them, and I wouldn't try. It matters to me that you know I don't believe it. I know you don't, she said. I knew that without you telling me. He looked at her steadily. There was something in his face that she'd started to recognize over the past weeks. The slight relaxing that happened when he stopped being prepared to be misunderstood. What do you need from me? He asked. Practically. What's actually useful? She appreciated the question. Most men in his position would have asked what he could do, which put the burden of imagination on the person being asked. He'd asked what was useful, which was different. Keep talking to Aldous, she said. And if the investigation goes forward and there are hearings, make sure Tom and Davy know they have standing to file complaints for the fence damage and the missing cattle. They might not know they can do that formally. I'll talk to them. And don't... She stopped. What? Don't make public gestures, she said carefully. On my behalf. The story being told about me right now is that I'm a manipulator who manufactured situations for advantage. Every public gesture you make in my direction gets used as evidence of how successful I was. The best thing you can do is let what's true be true on its own. He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated. Then he said, That's very good advice. It's just practical. Most good advice is... He stood up, and the geese shuffled backward 2 steps. He looked at them. Your geese don't like me. They don't like anyone, she said. It's their primary characteristic. Do they like you? They follow me around constantly and make noise at everyone else. I've chosen to interpret that as affection. He almost smiled. The same almost smile she'd seen before. The one that didn't quite commit but was real anyway. Aldous is going to move faster than he usually does, he said. I made it clear to him that the assessment timeline matters. He has enough now to make inquiries that are official, rather than informal. Good. He put his hat back on, touching the brim in a gesture that was acknowledgement rather than farewell, and walked back to his horse. She stayed on the porch and watched him go, and the geese followed her back inside when she turned, honking once at the gate as his horse moved out onto the track, having apparently decided to have the last word. The first crack appeared on Thursday. One of Grady's intermediaries, a man named Pell, who ran a small trading operation out of a property 12 miles north, made the mistake of trying to sell 3 of Davy Alvarez's cattle at the county exchange. The brand alteration was not good work. The exchange agent, who had known Davy's brand for 15 years, spotted it inside of 2 minutes and sent a rider to Aldous before Pell had finished his paperwork. Pell, faced with the specific situation of someone who has been caught holding something they can't explain, made a decision that people in that situation often make, which was to trade information for leniency before anyone with more at stake could instruct him otherwise. He talked to Aldous for 4 hours. She heard about it from Tom Emery on Friday morning, who had heard it from Davy, who had been at the exchange when the rider came back. The information Pell had provided apparently connected the livestock operation to the feed damage and the supply obstruction, and included 2 names she didn't recognize, and one she did. A man named Sorrel, who had worked briefly for the crane operation 2 years ago before moving on. She sat with that last piece for a long time. Sorrel at the crane operation. She didn't know what it meant, and she was careful not to assume she did, because the distance between a man who worked somewhere once and that place being responsible for his later activities was significant. But she filed it. The thing about a legal investigation in a small county was that it didn't stay contained. Within a week, Aldous had made enough inquiries in enough directions that the shape of what he was looking into was visible to anyone paying attention, and in Red Hollow, everyone paid attention to everything eventually. The social atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, not in one moment, but in the accumulating way that attitudes shift when the story people have accepted starts to look different in the new light of facts. Witnesses, it turned out, had things to say that they hadn't thought to say before, because nobody had asked them in an official capacity. The man who drove the supply wagon that had been obstructed on the Dorchester Road remembered details he'd mentioned to his employer and then set aside. 2 of the Emery hands had seen something near the north barn the night before the feed damage that they'd attributed to wind and now described differently. The pale roan horse appeared in 2 more accounts, ridden by a man matching a description that put him at 3 of the affected properties. And the women who had been managing the social narrative about Nora Whitaker found, as the week progressed, that the room in the conversation for that narrative was shrinking. Not because anyone directly argued against it, simply because the people who had been repeating it started to register that they'd been repeating something convenient to people with reasons to want Red Hollow's attention directed away from a land acquisition scheme. It was Margaret Whitmore who broke first, which surprised Nora when she heard about it. Though in retrospect she thought she shouldn't have been surprised, Margaret was the one among them with the most genuine social investment in her own reputation. And a reputation built on charm is more vulnerable to association with dishonesty than one built on competence. Margaret came to see Aldous voluntarily on the following Wednesday and told him that Sorrel had been at the crane operation because Dorothea Crane had hired him to manage some property work, and that Margaret had become aware approximately 6 weeks ago that some of what Dorothea was involved in was not strictly what she'd described it as, and that Margaret had not said anything about this, which she acknowledged was not her finest hour. It was not, Aldous agreed. Dorothea Crane did not break. She had her lawyer in from the county seat before the week was out and said precisely nothing to anyone without him present. Whether she had known the full shape of what Grady's scheme involved or had been an instrument of it without complete information was something the legal process would eventually determine. What was determined fairly quickly was that 2 of the property acquisition agreements filed in Grady's name carried notarization from an office in the county seat that linked back to money flowing through accounts with Dorothea's late husband's business structure, accounts that Dorothea had managed since his death. When this became known in Red Hollow, the ground shifted under the story everyone had been telling. Nora heard about it on a Thursday afternoon from Beth Culver, who had become something of a reliable source of information, partly because she was honest, and partly because she felt guilty about having repeated any of the earlier narrative and was compensating through thoroughness. "People are talking differently," Beth said. "About you. About what happened in August and September. Tom Emery told the story of the storm recovery at the exchange yesterday, and people listened differently than they would have a week ago. People listen to what they're ready to hear," Nora said. She was working on a piece of mending while they talked, which was not dismissiveness, but simply what she did when she was at home. She didn't stop her hands for conversations, which some people found disconcerting, and Beth had learned to accept. "Doesn't it bother you?" Beth asked. "That they had to know about Dorothea before they were willing to see me clearly?" Nora set down her work. "Some, but I understand it. People make sense of the world through the information they have. They had bad information." She picked the work back up. "What bothers me is the time it takes, because during the time people were telling a story about me being calculating, real things were happening to real operations. The Alvarez cattle, the Emery feed. That's money those families don't have to lose." Beth was quiet. "That's a very, I don't know. Most people in your position would be talking about their own reputation." "My reputation will sort itself out," Nora said. "It generally does, if you let it." She pulled a stitch through. "The Alvarez family's missing income doesn't sort itself out on its own. That's the difference." Helen Bassett left Red Hollow the following week, citing family matters in Cincinnati that required her return. Nobody who knew her well found this surprising. Nobody who didn't know her well found it worth remarking on. She had arrived, made her attempts, and departed, and Red Hollow absorbed her absence the way it absorbed most things, by continuing regardless. Dorothea Crane remained. She was not the kind of woman who fled, and Nora, whatever else she thought about her, gave her that. She stayed in her house and managed her affairs through her lawyer and was present at the county exchange when her affairs required it, and looked at people with the contained expression of someone who has decided that dignity is a thing you carry regardless of what the surrounding circumstances are doing. It was not entirely without its own kind of courage. Nora thought so, even if she couldn't have said it to anyone without being misunderstood. The water rights assessment was 8 days away when Aldous informed Brock Hayes formally that Earl Grady's acquisition filings for 3 Eastern Corridor properties were under review and suspended pending investigation. The assessment would proceed with current ownership records intact. Hayes told Nora on a Saturday afternoon, standing at her gate with his hat in his hands, the late October light going long and gold across the dry grass of her 40 acres. He told her simply the way he told her most things. Without decoration, just the fact of it. She stood on her porch and heard it and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a thing that had been leaning dangerously for weeks finally finding its footing. "It's not finished," she said. "The investigation's going to run a while." "No," he agreed. "It's not finished, but the assessment is protected." She nodded. The geese moved around the corner and one of them bit at the hem of her skirt, which it did when it wanted attention, and she wasn't paying it any. "Nora," Brock said. She looked at him. He was standing at her gate in the gold light with his hat in both hands, and the look on his face of a man who has something to say and has been working up to saying it for longer than he'd probably admit. "Ask me to supper," she said. He blinked. Then something broke open in his expression. Not quite the almost smile, something more than that. "Will you have supper with me?" he said. "On Friday, in town." "Yes," she said, "I will." The goose bit her skirt again. She looked down at it. "You are a menace," she told it, which it received with complete indifference. And when she looked back up, Brock Hayes was smiling. Actually smiling, the real version, the one that changed his whole face. And the late light was warm on the dry grass of her 40 acres, and she thought that it was strange how a season that had been mostly difficult could end at an angle that felt, if not exactly like relief, then like something close enough to it that the distinction didn't much matter. Friday supper in town turned out to be at the hotel dining room, which was the only establishment in Red Hollow that had tablecloths and candles on the tables, and a menu written on a chalkboard instead of shouted through a kitchen window. Nora had been inside it twice before in her life. Once for a county ranchers meeting that Pearl had dragged her to, once to deliver an altered jacket to a traveling businessman who'd torn it on a fence and needed it back before his stage departed. She knew what the tablecloths looked like. She had not expected to be sitting across from Brock Hayes at one of those tables, while a waiter she didn't recognize poured water from a pitcher that was significantly nicer than anything she owned. She wore her second-best dress, which was in better condition than the green wool after the Frontier Ball. It was dark blue, practical rather than fine, and she'd pressed it that afternoon and replaced a button that had gone loose. She looked acceptable. She did not look like someone who belonged in the hotel dining room in the way that belonging is performed. She looked like herself, which she'd decided on the ride in was going to have to be sufficient. "You're going to spend the whole meal being aware of the tablecloth," Brock said, about 5 minutes in. She looked at him. "I'm not. You looked at it twice while I was talking." "I was listening." "You were listening and looking at the tablecloth." There was no unkindness in it. He was just reporting what he'd observed, the way he usually was. "It's a nice tablecloth. It doesn't require that much attention." "I was thinking," she said, "that it's a good quality cotton and whoever launders it is doing an excellent job with the starch." He looked at her, then he laughed. Not the almost smile, not the real smile she'd seen at her gate in the October light, but an actual laugh, short and unguarded, the kind that gets out before a person decides whether to let it. It changed his face completely. Yes, he said. "That's a very specific thing to notice." "I work with fabric," she said. "I notice fabric." "Fair enough." He picked up his water glass. "What else do you notice?" "Most things." She looked at the room, the other 2 occupied tables, the waiter near the kitchen door, the way the candlelight moved on the ceiling. "It's a habit. You get used to reading situations when you're operating alone. There's nobody else to catch what you miss." "How long have you been operating alone?" "My father died 4 years ago, but honestly..." She paused, deciding how honest to be, and decided fully honest was the only kind she knew how to do for any sustained period. It was closer to 6. The last 2 years he was alive, he wasn't really managing things. I was. He didn't perform sympathy, which she appreciated. He just absorbed it. "Your mother?" "When I was 11, she said it simply. It was a long time ago. She was a capable woman. I learned most of what I know that's actually useful from watching how she handled things. The pie crust, among other things." He was quiet for a moment in the comfortable way she'd come to recognize. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the silence of someone who is thinking before they speak, which was rarer than it should have been, and she valued it. "I lost my mother young too," he said. "Different circumstances." but I know what it does to a person's development. You learn self-reliance very fast because you have to, and then it takes years to figure out that self-reliance isn't the same as being unable to need anything from anyone. She looked at him across the tablecloth she'd been studying. Is that something you've figured out? I'm working on it, he said. You? Similar position, she said. Working on it. The food came and they ate and talked about the water rights assessment, which had concluded the previous Tuesday with the Eastern Corridor properties confirmed in their current ownership. They talked about the investigation into Grady, which was proceeding through the county legal system with the slow grinding inevitability of official processes that have enough evidence to move forward and enough complexity to take a significant amount of time doing it. They talked about the cattle that had been recovered, most of them, not all, and the barn reconstruction, which Curtis had organized with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. At some point, the conversation moved away from practical things and into the kind of territory that opens up between two people when they've been through something together and are sitting in a quiet room with no particular urgency about the time. He told her about his father, who had built the Hayes operation from almost nothing and had been a harder man than the one Brock was trying to be. She told him about the winter they'd lost all the animals, and how her father had sat at the kitchen table for 3 days without eating much, and how she'd been the one to go to their nearest neighbor and arrange credit, which was not something a girl of 14 should have needed to do, but which she had done, and which had made her permanently less afraid of asking for things than most people were. You were 14, he said, almost 15. It felt important to clarify that at the time. It doesn't as much now. Were you scared? She thought about it honestly. Yes, but I've found that scared and capable aren't mutually exclusive. You can be both at the same time. People talk about fear like it's something you overcome before you can act. I don't think that's how it works. I think you act, and the fear is just there alongside you, and eventually you've done enough things while scared that you stop finding it surprising. He looked at her for a long moment. I want to tell you something, he said. All right. I've been on this land for 7 years since my father handed it over. I've hired good people and made decent decisions, and the operation is what it is, but I've been running it the way you run something when you're primarily concerned with not losing it, protecting it. He turned his water glass slowly. You came into that storm and saw what needed doing before anyone else did. You mapped out Grady's scheme on a piece of paper that made Aldous actually move. You knew which men had which skills across 6 operations because you'd spent years paying attention to people other people were ignoring. He stopped. I'm not saying any of that to make you feel, I know, she said. Keep going. I've been thinking about what this place could be, he said. Not just the ranch, the whole county. The water allocation that's coming, there's enough if it's managed well. The smaller operations don't have to keep struggling the way they do. There's a way to build infrastructure out here that helps everyone, rather than just the people who already have enough. He paused. I can see it. I'm just not sure I have the right way of thinking about people to get there from here. She looked at him steadily. You're asking me something. I'm not sure how to ask what I'm asking. Try anyway. He set down the glass. I'd like you to be part of what I'm building, he said. Not as, he worked through it, not as someone I've hired to advise me, something more than that. The dining room was very quiet. The other tables had cleared while they'd been talking. The waiter had withdrawn with the discretion of someone who understands when a conversation has moved into territory that doesn't need witnesses. Something more is a fairly open category, she said. I know. He looked like a man who has done something difficult and knows it and isn't sorry he did it. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to know that's where I am. She thought about Dorothea telling her some doors don't open from the outside. She thought about standing in her cabin deciding that the night of the gathering was going to be what it was going to be. She thought about her mother's method for pie crust and 14-year-old Nora asking a neighbor for credit and the geese following her around the yard with their undiscriminating devotion and the specific weight of a sluice gate mechanism that doesn't want to move. I know where you are, she said. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. She thought about it for approximately the next 4 days, which was less thinking and more the process of sitting with something and letting it settle into its actual shape rather than the shape anxiety gives things. On the 5th day, she drove to the Hayes Ranch in the early morning before most of the hands were working and found Brock at the main water tank doing something with the inlet valve that he appeared to be only partially succeeding at. I'll marry you, she said from the wagon. if that's what you meant by something more. He looked up from the valve. He had grease on his hands and he was wearing his work hat, not his going-to-town hat, and he looked slightly surprised in the way of someone who knew something was coming and is surprised anyway by the actual moment of it. That's what I meant, he said. Then yes, she said, but I want to tell you some things first. He set down the wrench. All right, my 40 acres stay in my name, she said. I'm not merging them into the Hayes operation. They're mine and they'll stay mine. That's fair. I'll work alongside you on everything we decide together. But decisions we make together means both of us, not me advising and you deciding. Agreed. And the irrigation on the Eastern Corridor, the plan you were talking about at supper. I want to start on that in spring. I've been thinking about how to approach the smaller operations, and I have some ideas. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his wrench. Come inside when you're ready, he said. Curtis has coffee on, and I need to finish this valve. It was not a romantic morning. It was a Tuesday morning on a working ranch, and there was a valve that needed fixing and coffee in the foreman's building, and a woman in a wagon who had just agreed to share her life with a man she had known for years and was only beginning to understand. And it was ordinary and real, and nothing like the way these things happen in the stories people tell about the frontier, which was, she thought, exactly right. Set. They married in December at Pearl Holloway's barn, which was smaller than a formal occasion warranted and exactly right for the people they were. Pearl cried, which she would have done regardless of the circumstance. Davy Alvarez brought his entire family and his fiddle player. Tom Emery came and stood in the back and shook Brock's hand with both of his and told Nora she'd done a fine thing, which made her laugh because it sounded like a comment on a piece of sewing rather than a marriage, and which she understood was the highest compliment Tom knew how to give. Dorothea Crane was not there. She was dealing, by December, with legal proceedings that occupied most of her attention and would continue to do so for the better part of a year before the county court finished with them. The investigation into Grady's scheme had expanded past Red Hollow into the county seat and had turned up 3 other operations in 2 other counties that had been subject to similar pressure. Grady himself was facing charges serious enough that his lawyer had advised him to say very little, and he had taken that advice with a thoroughness that suggested he was actually capable of learning from situations, just not the situations that would have required him to be honest. Nora followed the proceedings without satisfaction and without gloating, which surprised people who expected her to feel vindicated. She did feel vindicated, technically. The record was clear enough. But vindication turned out to be a small and quickly exhausted emotion compared to the actual work of what came after. The work was what interested her. In February, she and Brock held a meeting at the Holloway barn, Pearl's idea, hosted on Pearl's property because Pearl understood that neutral ground mattered when you were asking people who had been under pressure for 6 months to trust a new structure. They invited every operation in the Eastern Corridor, small and large. 11 showed up. 2 sent word they couldn't come but were interested. 1 didn't respond, which Nora noted and set aside for later. She'd drawn up a proposal. It wasn't complicated. She was not a person who believed in making simple things complicated, but it had been thought through carefully over the winter months. The water rights allocation from the November assessment had come through for the Hayes spread as the largest viable holding in the corridor, which was what Grady had been trying to prevent. The proposal redirected part of that allocation into a shared infrastructure project, a proper irrigation system for the Eastern Corridor, collectively maintained, with usage rights proportional to contribution and oversight handled by a committee of the participating operations. You're giving away water rights, Tom Emery said, looking at the paper she'd given him. He sounded like a man who suspects he's misunderstanding something. Not giving, she said. Sharing. There's a difference. The Hayes operation keeps primary rights. What we're doing is building infrastructure that makes the shared allocation usable for everyone, which means the whole corridor is more productive, which means everyone's land is worth more and everyone's operation is more stable. Tom looked at the paper again. This requires us to contribute labor. Yes. And money. Small amounts, less than you'd spend hauling water from the river for another bad summer. He thought about it. And you think this works? I think it works if people maintain it honestly and everyone does their share, she said. I don't think it works if people don't. Those are the same terms as every other cooperative thing people have ever tried to do. By the end of the meeting, 8 of the 11 operations had signed on. The other 3 took another 2 weeks and 2 conversations before they agreed, and one of them required Brock to personally walk the planned channel route with the owner before he was convinced it wasn't going to damage his grazing land. Construction started in April, when the ground was thawed enough to work properly. It took 6 weeks and was messier and more expensive than the plan had budgeted, and involved at least 2 arguments between neighboring operations that Nora had to mediate, sitting at someone's kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, working through who was right and who was wrong with the same methodical patience she brought to a complicated alteration. Sometimes she was right. Sometimes she was wrong. She amended the plan twice and would have amended it more if the amendments had been necessary. Being attached to the original plan when reality suggested otherwise was something she'd watched cause damage her whole life, and had no interest in adding to the list of ways she made errors. The first water ran through the new channel in late May. Tom Emery stood at his field's intake point and watched it come and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "I'll be damned," in a tone that covered several things at once. Nora stood beside him and watched too. The water was not particularly impressive looking. It was water in a channel, brown at the edges from the recently worked soil, moving at the pace water moves when it's not in a hurry. But it was there, and it was going where it was needed, and no one had been able to stop it getting built. "Your mother would have liked this," Tom said. She looked at him. He'd known her mother, she remembered, in the way that people know each other in small places. Not closely, but durably. "She would have," she said. "She had a practical mind." "So do you." He looked at the water. "It's not the same thing as being cold. People think practical means cold. It doesn't." She thought about that on the drive home. The spring evening was long, and the road back to the Hayes Ranch, her home now, in the specific new way of something that was still becoming familiar, was lined with the first green things pushing up through ground that had been hard all winter. The geese were at the ranch now, relocated in December against their loud objections, and now apparently resigned to the new situation, which they had decided to handle by tormenting Curtis's youngest hand, who found them hilarious, which only made it worse. Brock was at the kitchen table with papers when she came in. He looked up. "How'd the intake work?" "Well." She hung her coat. Tom cried a little. Tom doesn't cry. Tom said "I'll be damned" in a specific tone of voice that is Tom's version of crying. He almost smiled. "That's accurate." He looked back at his papers. "We got a letter from the county surveyor's office. They want to document the project as a model. Send someone out to look at it." She stopped. "A model. Apparently 2 other counties are dealing with similar drought allocation problems, and someone at the state level has heard about what we did." She stood in the middle of the kitchen and absorbed this. It was strange. Not unwelcome, but strange. The way things you do for specific and immediate reasons sometimes turn out to have edges that extend past where you can see from where you're standing. She'd built the proposal to solve a concrete problem for 11 operations in one corridor. She had not been thinking past that. "What do you want to do with that?" she asked. "I want to do what you think is right," he said. "It's your project." "It's our project. It's your idea, and your framework, and your 6 weeks of arguments with people who needed convincing. I contributed capital and my name on the deed." He said it without false modesty, just accurately, the way he said most things. "What do you want to do?" She thought about it. "Let them come," she said. "If it helps somewhere else, that's worth the time." He nodded and went back to his papers, and she started supper, and the kitchen was warm, and the geese were probably terrorizing someone outside, and the evening light came through the west window at the angle she'd been learning since December, the way light comes through windows you're just beginning to know. There are things that don't resolve cleanly, and Red Hollow was full of them in the years that followed. Grady's legal case ran 18 months and ended with penalties that were significant without being everything the affected operations had lost, because that's what legal processes do. They produce outcomes that are approximately just rather than exactly just, and you take what you get and account for the remainder yourself. Dorothea Crane paid her portion of the settlement and kept her operation, and became, over time, a figure the town treated with the complicated regard reserved for people who have been genuinely wrong about something important and have remained standing anyway. Nora never forgave her, and never needed to, because forgiveness wasn't the point. The point was that the damage had been accounted for, and the structures that allowed it had been changed, And what Dorothea did with her private conscience afterward was not Nora's responsibility to manage. The irrigation project became what the county surveyor had suggested it might become. 2 neighboring counties implemented versions of it over the following 3 years, with modifications Nora had recommended based on what hadn't worked in the original build because she'd kept notes and the notes were honest. She went to one of those counties herself to consult, which was the first time she'd been more than 30 miles from Red Hollow in 11 years, and she found the distance useful in a way she hadn't anticipated. It showed her the shape of what she'd built from an angle she couldn't see when she was inside it. The ranch flourished. This is a plain fact and not a comfortable one to sit with, because flourishing sounds like everything worked out perfectly, and nothing ever works out perfectly. There were bad years and personnel problems, and one disastrous season with cattle illness that cost more than they'd projected and required 2 years to fully recover from. But the operation grew and the land was managed well, and the people who worked it were paid reasonably and treated as people rather than as components, which was something Nora cared about with a specificity that occasionally created friction with the practical requirements of running a large operation, and which she dealt with by finding solutions rather than abandoning the principle. She kept her 40 acres. She always kept her 40 acres. She drove out there on Sunday mornings when the weather was good, sometimes alone and sometimes with Brock, and she walked the land and checked the fences and sat for a while on the old stump where she'd worked the harness that morning he'd first come to her gate. It was not a valuable piece of property by anyone's measure except hers. She had no interest in anyone else's measure. Pearl Holloway lived to be 83 and died in the spring on a Tuesday, which Pearl would have said was a sensible day to die, not dramatic. Nora sat with her in the last week and held her hand and talked to her about ordinary things, the way Pearl had always preferred, not about meaning or legacy, but about what was growing in the garden and who was feuding with whom in town and whether the hotel dining room had finally fixed the problem with their soup. Pearl laughed at the soup thing the day before she died, which was the right note. The town changed. Towns do. Families arrived and families left, and the county seat grew larger and the railroad came through closer than it had been, which changed the economics of everything in ways that took years to fully trace. But the corridor operations stabilized in a way they hadn't been before the irrigation project, and stability, Nora had always believed, was underrated, not as a final condition, but as the soil that other things grow in. You couldn't plant anything in ground that kept shifting. The people who had laughed at her dress at the Holloway gathering didn't stop existing. Some of them changed their view of her based on what they subsequently learned. Some of them didn't change their view, but stopped expressing it, which was a different thing and a more honest accounting of human nature. A few of them came to her for advice over the years. Practical advice about operations, about legal matters, about the corridor infrastructure. And she gave it without reference to what had come before, because the advice was the thing. And dragging history into a practical question only made the practical question harder to answer. She was not widely loved in the way that sentimental stories require their protagonists to be. She was respected, which she found more durable. There were people who found her abrasive. There were people who found her cold. There were people who couldn't entirely get past the fact of who she'd been before, the woman at the food table, the seamstress in the patched dress, and who saw everything she'd become through that lens, either as a story of remarkable transformation or as evidence that she'd always been calculating, depending on which version of her they'd chosen to hold. She found she could live with all of those versions. She couldn't control what people decided about her. She'd known that since she was 14 years old, asking a neighbor for credit. You do what you do, and you let the world make of it what it makes of it, and then you do the next thing. Brock was, in the way of complicated people sharing a life, sometimes difficult and sometimes wrong and sometimes stubborn, past the point of usefulness. And she was the same, and they argued about real things with the directness of two people who had come to their relationship through honesty and considered dishonesty within it a waste of time they didn't have. They did not agree on everything. They agreed on enough. They trusted each other in the specific way trust develops between people who have watched each other under pressure and found the person still standing there when it was over. One evening in the 3rd year of their marriage, sitting on the porch in the late summer when the days were finally cooling and the corridor's water system was moving quietly through the channels they'd built, Brock said, "Do you think you're happy?" She considered the question. She always considered questions, which occasionally annoyed him and which he'd learned to wait out. I think I'm doing work that matters, she said. And I think I'm doing it with someone I trust. And I think the land is mostly okay, and the geese are insufferable, and we lost 8 head last month to that illness that we still haven't identified the source of, which is a problem I need to solve before winter. She looked at him. Is that happiness? I think it might be, he said. Then yes, she said. Probably. The geese made noise somewhere in the yard, which they did when they were unhappy about something, which was most of the time. The evening settled around the porch. The corridor was mostly quiet, the way working land is quiet when the working day is done. Not empty, just resting. She'd started her life with almost nothing, which was not a romantic statement, but a logistical one. 40 acres that were trying to dry out, a cracked mirror, thread that didn't quite match, and a habit of paying attention to things other people found too small to notice. She had not been saved by anyone. She had not been transformed into something other than what she'd always been. What she'd done was work, and wait, and refuse to pretend the world was other than it was, and make herself useful in ways that were real rather than performed. And eventually the world had arranged itself around that in a way she found livable. That was the truth of it. Not a triumph, not a fairy story, just a woman who knew what she was and held on to it through a hard season and came out the other side still recognizably herself, which is harder than it sounds and worth more than most people know until they've tried to do it. The evening light went long and gold across the front of the yard, and she sat in it, and she thought about what needed doing tomorrow, and that was enough.